President Donald Trump this week fighting back against big tech censorship. He filed a class action lawsuit against Facebook, Twitter, and Google and their CEOs for censoring him and other conservatives on their platforms in the wake of the January 6th breach at the Capitol. For more on this week we spoke with Jenna Ellis. She's the host of the Just the Truth podcast. She's also a former senior advisor and counsel to President Trump. We were also joined by Brett Tolman, a former federal prosecutor and the executive director of Right on Crime. Jenna, first to you on this, using the First Amendment to go after these private companies. We heard that mentioned several times today. How do you do this?
Yeah, well, I think President Trump is continuing to try every legal avenue, just like he always did in office. And this shows that he is not giving up the fight against big tech censorship. This is important to the American people. It's important, of course, to him personally. He, of course, was affected like so many other conservatives. And I think that this type of a class action will be an interesting test for our justice system. I mean, just on Friday, John, at least two justices, Gorsuch and Thomas, indicated in a different case, it was about libel against public figures, but they indicated that the New York Times versus Sullivan 1964 decision needs to be revisited in the wake of misinformation. And that was a First Amendment issue. So I think that this shows that it is a ripe challenge, and it's something that will be an interesting test of our legal system. I personally am very grateful to President Trump for continuing to fight this fight, challenge Section 230, and challenge big tech to say, listen, you guys say that you're not the arbiters of truth, but clearly you are discriminating against conservatives for viewpoint, and that is not okay when you are a platform that is supposed to recognize that everyone's opinion is free and fair to be posted. So I think this is a great suit, and we'll see how it progresses.
Now, Brett, I can think of a case in point specifically on this. Corey Mills, who's a congressional candidate, a regular on this show, he is trying to get a blue check mark, get verified by Twitter right now. His Democratic opponent has this, and a lot of folks could see this as a competitive advantage in a congressional campaign because Twitter has become so important. So as a layperson in this conversation here, help me in my caveman brain understand this. Because Congress passed Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996, that gives these companies special privileges, and they use those privileges to censor or hinder the speech of a political candidate or someone in the public sphere. So is that the kind of, I don't want to call it roundabout because that cheapens it, I think, but that's how the First Amendment can be used, I guess, for protection for citizens from these private companies. Am I getting this right?
Yeah, John, and you're certainly not a caveman on this. I think you have a very reasoned analysis, and it really does boil down to sort of a simple analysis, and that is, how large and significant is the platform? Are those that are in charge? Are they discriminating against certain cross sections of their followers, and are they themselves engaging in a manner that sort of picks winners and losers? Are they publishing, for example, content by their decisions and by the policies that they're implementing? Are they publishing, for example, one particular narrative and one ideological set of beliefs versus another? And if that's the case, then the challenge, like Jenna said, is one that the courts are going to want to look at, because they're going to see how significant and substantial these platforms have become. You raise the blue check mark, and think about just that small little gesture. And as one who doesn't have a blue check mark and just recently got rejected, yeah, I have to think, in my mind, is that because I'm a conservative? And if it is, then there's going to be a lot of challenges to this.
Yeah, and how do I join? I mean, I've never applied for the blue check mark. I kind of look at it as being branded by Jack because they do change the rules a little bit. But no, it's important because, Brett, people say, well, I don't know if that's you or not on Twitter, and that's when I'm kind of like, well, maybe I do need the blue check mark. And Jenna, what's interesting about having this conversation with both of you is we've talked about this in private amongst ourselves, and we've talked about it here on this show, and we've all kind of gone from this, natural position for conservatives to be like, well, I don't know if it's a good idea for the government to get really involved in this. But when you see, Jenna, story after story that has been picked up and perpetuated, and you see the way, you think about COVID-19 and some of these therapeutic drugs and the way that Facebook and some of these platforms banned any talk of this stuff, without giving, their users any kind of insight into the methodology for doing this. They were silencing doctors, medical doctors, board certified doctors who said, there might be another way here. And that, again, I think there is evidence of harm caused by these policies, Jenna.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always been a conservative principle that we are conserving the principles of liberty and freedom. And that also means that big tech, as private companies, still have to follow the rule of law. We've never been in a situation where we say government should never interfere into private enterprise when there is either a constitutional question or even an equity question. I mean, that's why civil lawsuits are allowed. That's why antitrust is a federal issue.
Stay with us. When we come back, we're going to talk about this lawsuit and other folks who are affected, including DC Draino, also known as Rogan O'Hanley. He's a lawyer and a conservative activist. We'll get his take next. All right, welcome back to Newsmax in Depth. I'm John Bachman. A conservative lawyer and political commentator is in a lawsuit against Twitter after the site flagged a series of tweets from him questioning election integrity. They eventually suspended his account outright. And joining us now to talk more about this as it relates to President Trump's class action lawsuit is conservative activist and attorney Rogan O'Hanley, also known as DC Draino. So Rogan, tell us about what happened with you specifically and why you were kicked off Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, I called for the same things that Stacey Abrams called for when she refused to concede the 2018 Georgia gubernatorial race. I called for the same thing that Mayor de Blasio recently called for, which is an investigation into the mayoral primary race where 135,000 test votes were inadvertently included in the results. So, I looked at the evidence, the facts. I'm a licensed attorney in the state of California, and I called for further investigations into the 2020 presidential election, especially in certain battleground states. And, not only was I ultimately deplatformed by Twitter because they believe it created a risk of violence to call for audits, but we did find out later through Judicial Watch, FOIA-type requests of California Secretary of State emails that I was actually put on a government list of people they wanted to censor, okay? So let me make that clear, and this probably affects President Trump's lawsuit as well. This was not just a private company acting on its own volition. There was government coercion at the state level by now Senator Padilla's Secretary of State office, and I was ultimately censored and banned off Twitter.
Right, and Padilla is the senator who was selected to replace Kamala Harris, just for a little background there. And this is really where the rubber meets the road, isn't it, Rogan, where you have these private corporations colluding, we love that term, with the government to censor certain opinions and viewpoints. And that's where you really have the First Amendment issue.
That's right, because the First Amendment, as so many people have correctly pointed out, protects against the, Congress or state legislatures infringing on free speech, right? So if you were holding a sign in a public park that said, I don't like, the police department, and a police officer went over and arrested you, everyone would be rightfully outraged that that is an infringement on free speech. But what if the police officer tells someone else to go detain you, say a private security guard? That's effectively the same thing, and that's effectively what happened with me in this situation. And again, we talk about the public square, which is where First Amendment most protects us. If we're all locked down, where is the public square?
Right.
It's in the digital world, and social media prevented us from exercising free speech, especially over the last year.
Now, I know you have already signed up for Getter, and you are always, on these platforms, you have multiple handles as well, because you have to protect yourself nowadays because they can shut these things down willy-nilly. But is this the answer, more social media platforms, or do we need to actually have this kind of place where everybody goes, the public square, if you will, because some people fear if you have everyone splintering off into different corners, talking about different things, then you don't really have that discourse and debate that this country and any, healthy republic needs to survive.
I think it's a dual approach. I think, in the first instance, we do have, we encourage market alternatives, right? The free market is a very powerful thing. As these companies continue crushing conservative speech on their platforms, it opens up a multi-billion-dollar opportunity for other platforms to, welcome disaffected users. But I also think that we do need to pursue not only litigation in the courts, but legislative change at the state and federal level as well to protect our free speech rights. When Section 230 was created in the 90s, the internet was a brand new thing, and nobody could have predicted the rise of Facebook, Twitter, et cetera. But now we do need to, have Section 230 reform. We need to protect our free speech rights on social media.
That's it for this edition of In Depth. I'm John Bachman, and from all of us here at Newsmax TV, have a great weekend.